Hey everyone, welcome back to the Anderson Bros Outdoors. I'm Jake, and today we're going to go over something that I think is a requirement for every RC car enthusiast. Alright, welcome back. So, I know it's been a while, I apologize for that. We've been very busy with work and other festivities that I won't bore you with details on. Just one note, you can see that I did have a section of my face or skin removed right here on my cheek from skin cancer. They took about a quarter size. You can see actually where the cut is there. I can't actually grow facial hair anymore. Moral of the story is this hobby involves being outside. Please make sure that you're applying sunscreen and other protective measures because let me tell you firsthand that is not a fun experience. And realistically, once your skin is damaged, you cannot undamage it. So not only should you wear sunscreen, but you should also get checked regularly. Anyway, with that being said, let's get into today's topic of discussion, and that is 3D printing. I wanted to go over really the basics from start to finish on 3D printing. First of all, why would you 3D print? Well, you can design or download from Cats 3D, Thingiverse, things of that nature, parts that you can print out. So here's an example of a part, right? This is a part that I designed and printed out and actually released on Thingiverse. It's for the Rock Pirate chassis kit for the Phoenix RTR, or any Phoenix for that matter. So essentially, the way that it works is you print out the piece, so this would sit in the frame rails between the Rock Pirate chassis for the servos. You put the servos on there, and then you set this on top of it like such, or screw it on with the servo. And what this does is it gives you a bumper, and it also gives you the stock mounting holes for the Phoenix body, so it will sit in the place where it should, which mitigates the stock mounting system. So this is just an example, very easy to print, and so here's one reason why you would want to purchase a 3D printer. These examples here are PETG and this is PLA. We'll talk about the filament types in a minute. This was all done with the printer that I'm about to show you. Another reason that you would want a 3D print is this. We have a 3D printed body. You can download, buy, or make your own 3D body setup. This 3D body just so happens to be a body that is supposed to resemble a Toyota Hilux. So it does have to be printed in 3 pieces because my printer is not big enough to print it in 1 piece. I added these tabs to the part so that way when I glued it together, right, I could glue and there would be material there to hold it, not just the seam. A couple examples of why you would want a 3D printer. Now let's talk about the process. Alrighty, so this right here is an Ender 3V2. This is one of the most common printers on the market. It is relatively cheap. At Micro Center I paid $150 for this while it was on sale. Worth every penny. So let's talk a little bit about it. So first of all, you can see that this is not stock by any imagination, right? So we do have a different or a 3D printed fan setup on it. We do have some other mods to it, right? So you can see the Raspberry Pi here. Let's just pretend for a minute that this is all stock. All stock, this printer does fantastic right out of the box. I would recommend getting one if you're just going to print very basic parts, such as maybe bodies or other small miscellaneous parts, maybe scale parts, or you want to print this example here, the Rock Pirate kit, right? So this was actually printed on this printer. Let's go in and talk about what you want to see in a printer. So again, this printer here is a great entry-level printer. If you want to print with PLA Plus or PETG, this is the printer that you want. Now, before we dive into covering this printer, I do want to talk about one thing really quickly, and that is filament. So, I just named off a couple of filaments, but I want to touch on them overall because it's very crucial that you understand the filament type before you actually acquire a printer. So, in this filament we have PLA. So, PLA or PLA Plus is probably the most common printed material. So it is very rigid, it is very brittle, It is very strong. This is, again, the most common. So I'm not going to list all of the properties of these filaments, but you can do some research for yourself. Just, go to Google or whatever and Google PLA or filament differences, things of that nature. So PLA, most common, probably the most used. Strong, brittle, it does absorb moisture. The next one you have is ABS. Now this one is not necessarily as common. It is starting to become more common. The problem with ABS is it actually emits a toxic fume into the air. So you need to have either an enclosure to print this, or you need to have an exhaust system of some sort to print it to ensure that you are doing it safely. Otherwise, you could hurt your lungs or potentially get some type of toxic exposure. The other reason that this is not necessarily as used is because it requires a very high temperature nozzle, so this thing here, but we'll get into that in a minute. Next filament that I want to talk about is PETG. So PETG is similar in nature to PLA. The difference is that it is not as brittle. So it'll bend before it breaks, and it also has a much higher temperature resistance. That is another common thing. It is a little harder to print, I think, than PLA, but it is definitely an option. Now, the fourth filament that I'm going to talk about is TPU. So TPU is extremely different than the other three. So these other three are mainly very, I would say, structural based. They're very rigid. They have a solidified compound, whereas the TPU is made to be more malleable. So here's an example. So this, you can see, is TPU or PETG, right? So it would be more rigid. Well, here is an example of TPU. I'm sorry. This would be an example of... So this would be an example of PLA, PETG, or ABS. You can see it's very rigid. It doesn't have a whole lot of malleability to it. Now this would be an example of TPU. So you can actually see that it is very malleable, but it is malleable depending on how you print it. So these are the different filaments, the most common filaments, and plays a big role in when selecting a printer. So with that being said, I'm going to set these aside. Getting back to the printer, there's some key things that you want to look at when you're selecting a printer. First of all, what filament are you going to utilize? And realistically, PLA and TPU are going to be the two filaments that any RC enthusiast are going to print. Now, there are some things to note about those filaments. TPU requires a 300 degree Celsius hot end, meaning that this tip here, or this nozzle, needs to at least be able to heat up to 300 degrees. This printer hot end is only good for 250. Realistically, this TPU is not going to be printed very easily with this printer. Can it be done? Absolutely. Is it going to work well all the time? Probably not. If you're just going to be printing hard parts such as PETG or PLA, this is the printer to utilize. Now, that's just the hot end or the extruder, right? So let's talk about one other key component here, which this printer no longer has, but is very crucial when selecting a printer. So traditionally, the Ender 3 V2 has the way that the filament is fed. There are two different ways. There is what's called a Bowden style, and there is what's called a direct drive. So you can see here that we actually have the direct drive in place. So if I turn the printer to the side so you can see it, you see that this servo here is feeding the filament directly into the extruder, or the hot end, if you will, and feeding it through the nozzle, and it's printing it. So that is not how this printer comes from the factory. The servo that feeds the hot end is actually running through a Bowden system, which is a tube. So it sits here and runs through about a 5 to 8 inch tube into the hot end, or the extruder, into the nozzle. So basically what that means is that you have a significant delay between the servo feeding the filament and the hot end reacting. This is not such a big deal when you're working with hard filaments such as PLA, PETG, ABS, because that filament doesn't actually move. But when you're working with filaments like TPU, you can see that the filament is stretchy, right? It's elastic. And so as you're pushing the filament in through the tube into the hot end, first of all, it's going to compress. And so you're going to need to probably add more filament than what you would think, because you have to accommodate for that compression. Now, also, when you go to retract the filament, because you stopped that print section and you're lifting and you're moving to another location, you have to subsequently calculate for that retraction, right? So the retraction is going to have expandability in it. And so it's not going to expand or retract the same distance as a more harder filament. What that means is that there are two things at this point that we need to look out for. We need to look out for the extruder temperatures and see to validate that it prints the filament that we want. And the second thing is the filament delivery system, so whether it's Bowden or direct drive. If you're only going to be printing a harder filament such as PETG or PLA, you would be fine with the Ender 3 V2. However, if you want to add TPU in the mix, it is better to have a direct drive system. With that being said, I have added a Swiss direct drive configuration to it, right? So I've added the Swiss direct drive hot end or extruder, and then that comes with the direct drive mount, right? So it actually sends the filament directly into the hot end and out the nozzle. So that requires you to print this additional fan cover, and then all of that stuff conforms to it. I think that was a $100 add-on, but we'll get to that later. Now, there are some other key features that you want to look for, and so this, you can see the bed here is actually glass. So with this, if you look at the bed, you can see that it has a lot of like leftover marks on it. So that is because I have to use a glue stick before every print. It's not really a requirement, but it makes the print stick way better on this glass surface. So how do you mitigate that? Well, you can actually purchase, some printers come with what's called a PEI plate. So this is a magnetic plate that just sits on the bed, and then when you get done with the print, you lift it up and you can remove the print, and away you go. It mitigates the issue with this glass. Now, there are certain situations where you'll want to use glass. I'm not an expert on 3D printing, so you'll have to Google that and figure that out for yourself. But for everything that I do, whether it is PLA or TPU, I use the PEI sheet. I haven't used this printer in some time because I have other printers, but I just don't have the space for it. So with that being said, those are really the key things that you're going to want to look for the printer itself. What printer would you purchase? Don't get hung up on this. I know that there's a lot of reviews. I know that there's a lot of people saying this or that or the other modifications. So you can modify it again. Add a different extruder. You can make it direct drive. On this printer, we actually added another Z-axis to make it twin Z-axis. You can see this one here and this one here. And then we also installed the Clipper. So Clipper is a firmware that runs off of Raspberry Pi and controls the printer. By default, these printers come with a firmware called Marlin, right? So Marlin runs it. And right out of the box, the printer should do everything that you want it to do. As long as you level it accordingly, it will be fine. Which is another thing that we've added on this, is that it does have a BL Touch sensor on it, so it does auto leveling. I'm going to tell you right now that that is probably as accurate as estimation or guesstimate. So the key thing for leveling is you want to make sure that you put the printer on 0, 0, 0, and then when you do that, the Z-axis will be down on 0, and so you shut the printer off, and then you can move the print head and the bed back and forth. So you'll want to start at one area, and then you'll use a piece of paper and you'll get it. You don't want to make it very tight. You want to make it to where there's a slight drag on the paper. And then you move it to the next portion of the bed. So you do it like on this, you do it right here on this point, then you do it on this point, then you do it on the rear right, and then the rear left. And then you repeat it 3 times to make sure that you have the exact distance between the nozzle and the bed where it's got a slight drag between that thin piece of paper. That will be your best result. Then you can do the auto leveling. The auto leveling does not take into account big distances. Again, it's a guesstimate. So at least from my experience, right out of the box, if you're going to print, that's what I would do. I would set everything to 0. I would do the manual leveling, and then you turn these knobs here to make the bed go up and down. and then you're off to the races. You print. Once you do the leveling, then you have to use a software called a slicer. What the slicer does is it converts a 3D object into a printable object. So it slices it. The reason that it's called a slicer is because it slices it into layers. You're printing layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're just stacking them on top of each other. So it's slicing it into these layers, and it's making it where it is printable. This is a very big topic for discussion, right? Which slicer do I use? Well, honestly, probably the easiest slicer to use is a slicer called Cura, right? So Cura, C-U-R-A, link is in the description below. It is the easiest slicer, it has the most options in it, and it has the best support structure systems in it. One thing that you're going to want to take into account is that when you're printing, you want to use potentially different nozzle sizes, right? So I'm going to go off on a tangent real quick. So by default, most printers come with a 0.4 millimeter nozzle size. I am impatient. I don't ever print with a 0.4 millimeter nozzle. I print with a 0.68 or 1 millimeter nozzles. Mostly I use a 0.8 millimeter nozzle. It knocks the print time of a 0.4 millimeter nozzle in half or more. It's not necessarily as accurate or as pretty as a 4 millimeter nozzle, but it makes the print time reduce significantly. And for most RC stuff, you don't really care. If it's a body, you're going to be sanding and adding Bondo or whatever to it, so you don't really care if it comes out rough or not because it's going to have lines either way. If you can get it done much faster, that is the route to take. Well, the reason that I went off on that tangent is because Cura has the best port for them, right? So you go into the software, you choose your printer, and then you choose your filament type and your nozzle size, and it will give you predefined settings. So from there, what you do is you go in and you import a print. So for example, if I'm going to import this print here, I import it into the slicer and I tell it to slice it. So here is a key thing that you need to make sure that you're doing. So you want to preview that print before you actually put it into your printer. The reason that I say this is that since I do use a 0.8 millimeter nozzle, some of these prints maybe require a 0.4 millimeter nozzle. And so if you look at the slicer, it'll tell you if the print is going to be good or not. And I'll also state that some things that I make in Blender and I export and I go to print, they look perfect in Blender, but when I go to slice them, they are not perfect at all. As a matter of fact, they're blotchy, they have completely missing areas and things of that nature. You will know by looking at the slicer in the preview if it is going to be a good print or not. So there's another thing that you can do is you can layer examiner. So you can actually click the little drag bar and look at each layer specifically, and you'll know based upon the color of that slice if that layer is actually going to get printed or not. If it does get printed, it'll be a certain color, and if it doesn't get printed, it'll be grayed out. So you always want to make sure that you're previewing your print before you actually save it to your SD card and put it in your printer. Because if you don't, the print could turn out bad. With that being said, slicer software, you have a laundry list of them. Cura, you could use the Creality one, you could use Prusa, you could use, you name it, right? There's probably thousands of different slicers out there. The slicers that I use are Cura and Prusa. So those two slicers. Then once you get done slicing the print, before you're actually done, there's one other thing that I want to talk about is supports. You want to really manipulate your print to where you don't need supports. So we'll take this for example. So this right here, you could print it any way you wanted it. So you could print it like this, you could print it like this, you could print it like this, like this, like this. It doesn't really matter. You need to make sure, though, that when you do print this, you understand that if you print it like this, you're going to have potentially a problem up here. Because if you're not using supports, the filament is going to droop right here, where it's trying to print over nothing. So the best case scenario is you want to print it flat, like this, because you're not going to need any supports, and it's going to stick to the bed and not have any issues at all. Again, if you print it like this, you'll have to add supports to it. Otherwise, you'll have to trim these upper pieces. You'll potentially have to trim them anyway with supports. But just ensure that you print in a way where you don't need supports. So here, let's take this piece for example. So this piece was printed just like this, right? You can see the layering here. How did that work? Well, I have to have a support for the front piece here because it doesn't touch the bed, you can see. And then I had to have a support for the middle section. There are different types of supports. You can use whatever supports you want. You can use full supports, But what I normally use or traditionally use are what's called tree supports. If we take an example of this hood here, right, for this truck, it was printed like this. So the reason that it was printed like this is because of this grill. This grill, if you were to add supports to it or print it like this or whatever, it would look terrible. And it's very hard to get in there with a grinder or a sander or whatever the case is and fix these small areas. I had to print it standing up like this, and what that does, you actually start with a tree support, and the tree support is two small areas, right? So think of like two small circles. Well, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then finally at the top it joins together. And where it joins, it gives you this area for a support. So you're not wasting as much filament that way, because you will have to have the support. If you don't have the support for this, it's not going to turn out good if it turns out at all. You're likely going to rip the print off the bed because of the wavy lines that the printer will leave without the supports, and it will leave you very frustrated. This is about a 12 to 16 hour print, and at the very end of it here, if it gets ripped off the bed and doesn't complete, that would leave you a very unhappy person, I promise. Ask me how I know. With that being said, the supports, I normally use tree, but you can play with the supports and use whatever you want. Once you save or slice it, you save it to the SD card, throw it in the printer, and you hit go. Realistically, you'll have your filament hanging up at the top. It'll be fed into your printer, whether it's Bowden or direct drive, and it's off to the races. It's very no touch, right? Now, let's talk about all of these modifications. The clipper, the BL Touch, the direct drives, all of this stuff. This didn't come with this printer. So there's two types of people in this world. There's people that want to do something, and then there's people that want to tinker with it until they can't tinker anymore. If it were me, what would I do? Well, if I wanted to print out RC car parts and I didn't really care about the printing world, I would probably purchase a Bamboo Labs printer. They have a printer for $7.99, and it is out of the box, just works. They also have another printer, I think is $1,500, but it is a full enclosed printer. It comes with the ability to use 4 different filaments, and again, out of the box, it just works. It runs Clipper by default, and it prints very, very fast. If I didn't want to tinker with it and add these add-ons and do all of this stuff, I would get the Bamboo Labs printers. I would probably purchase the $7.99 one, but if you're planning to print a bunch of TPU or ABS stuff, I would go ahead and spend the double the money and get the one that has the enclosure. The reason that I'm saying that is because I've spent days trying to dial this setup in with all of these add-ons. Before I spent days trying to dial this in, it was all stock, and guess what? I popped in the printer to Cura Slicer, I sliced it, I put the SD card in with the slice, and bam. X hours later, my print was phenomenal. As a matter of fact, this printed on the stock setup with Cura, no mods. You can see this turned out very good. Hindsight, I would have just left the printer stock. Personally, I'd much rather tinker with my RC trucks than have to worry about printing. And the reason that I say that is because when you start messing with these printers, any small change that you make can mess it up. And when you mess it up, that's the potential of wasting a $25 roll of filament or breaking something and having to fix it. And personally, on a 20 to maybe even 60 hour print, I want peace of mind to know that, hey, that print is going to finish successfully. And so that is why I would recommend the Bamboo Labs. Now, if you want to purchase one of these Ender 3 V2s and do all of these modifications, more power to you. I would not recommend it because it will cause more heartache than it's worth, right? That is actually why I don't use this printer anymore, because I cannot get it dialed in the way that I want it to and printing how I want it to print. Until I have more time to focus on this, which will probably be never, it's going to sit in the corner and not get utilized. The Tinker or whatever, if you guys want to buy a printer like this Ender 3 V2, then I would recommend doing it and then tinkering till your heart's content. Just know that when you spend 160 plus hours trying to get it to print how you want, yeah, it will be infuriating. Ask me how I know. Some other good printers are Creality makes an S1, the S1 versus the S1 Pro. I actually like the S1 better than the S1 Pro. So the S1 has the standard. This one doesn't have it anymore because it's got Clipper, but it's got the standard Creality controls that have the single dial. The S1 Pro actually has a touchscreen dial, and I hate it. I would much rather have the standard one because the touchscreen one is laggy. It's junk. The S1 Pro is better. It does have like 4 or 5 different upgrades on it, but I think for for the cost, if you can get the S1 Pro for a very good deal or on sale, splurge for that one. If you can't, the regular S1, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to go into the creation of the 3D parts and things like that. I could potentially do that in a video if people wanted to see that, but I think realistically, you know, a 3D printer is almost a requirement in the RC hobby. I mean, you break A-arms, you break body clips, you break things, you know, or if you want to print things. I mean, I've given away things that you can print on Thingiverse. Like this right here, one little part I think probably maybe costs $2 or $3 to print, and you're going to pay potentially 10 to 25 bucks for this through, we'll say a name brand site. If you can do this at home, even if it only lasts you 2 or 3 months, you could probably print a significant amount of these before spending money on another one. So again, you can look at our Cuts 3D and Thingiverse pages. They're mostly the same. I've thrown some things on Cuts 3D that I've charged for only because I have a lot of time in it, and it kind of helps recoup for the channel. So I don't save any money on this channel. As a matter of fact, all the giveaways that I've done have put me into a lot of negative equity for it, but I'm not here for the money. I'm here for the community. I'm here to give back, and I'm here to make sure that the rest of the people that maybe aren't as fortunate have an understanding of how to get there. And so the reason that I say that I would purchase the Ender 3 V2 is because, again, it's a cheap printer. If you could print 3 or 4 different chassis setups with it, I mean, you've already saved enough money to purchase the printer. You could print TPU with it. It just goes really slow. Like this on the S1 printer or S1 Pro takes, I think, 4 hours. It would take probably 6 to 8 hours to print on this printer. But, I mean, if you have time, there's nothing wrong with that. You could have a set of these tire inserts in 4 days. I think that it's a good printer. Are there better options out there? Absolutely. But there's better options for everything. I mean, if you had unlimited funding, you wouldn't need a 3D printer. You'd just purchase whatever was out there. So anyway, I think that's where I'm going to wrap this video up. If you have any more questions or concerns about 3D printing, please feel free to leave a comment below, and I will do my best to answer them. I know that we've been AFK for a while, but we are coming back. The weather has been terrible outside. I was going to get out and do some filming today, but it is currently raining, and so I'm hoping that tomorrow is a little better. If not, I am going to Colorado for 3 weeks, so I will be getting a ton of footage there with a bunch of different trucks, and I'll be able to share that experience with all of you guys. So thanks again for watching. We really appreciate it. At the 600 subscriber mark, I don't know what we're giving away, but we're going to give away something. At 1,000 subscribers, we are giving away a TRX-4M and maybe even something more. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the support, and have a good day.